Hi, I'm Clare Williams, an Associate Speaker and Tutor at OCCA, the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. Now, I recently spoke at Keswick Convention 2025 and shared some thoughts in the seminar stream. This short video is a summary of those seminars and some questions for us to consider going forward. The overall topic of the seminars looked at how we can transform culture, specifically, how do we make sense of our polarised culture? We explored further questions such as, how do Christians fall prey to our polarised culture? How can we address questions from our polarised culture? And in what practical ways can we stay focused upon the gospel? Now, before we get into the summary, I'd like to make clear that I approach this topic with a heart to see people consider Christianity as a credible worldview and ultimately recognise the truth and beauty of Jesus. As such, my intention is not to win arguments, but people. The Bible gives us sound advice for this in 1 Peter 3:15, where we're encouraged to revere Christ as Lord, always be prepared to give an answer to anyone who asks us to give the reason for the hope that we have, but do this with gentleness and respect. So on the one hand, we are challenged to articulate clearly what we believe about Jesus and why we believe it. Yet on the other hand, we must do so with a gentle and respectful approach. With that in mind, let's go to our first question. How do Christians fall prey to our polarised culture? We don't have to look far to see that there is a real conflict between the political left and right. Mainstream news reporting and social media provide information and fuel to the fire of these opposing perspectives. Individuals and groups on the opposite ends of the political spectrum can often label each other with pejoratives such as bigoted or woke. Sadly, when Christians take either side uncritically, and by that I mean not asking questions about each view and seeing what does or does not align with Christian values, we can become part of the problem. Ed Stetzer gives us some strident words to consider in his book, Christians in the Age of Outrage, How to Bring Our Best When the World is at its Worst. Referring to the Starbucks Christmas Cup controversy of 2015, where a Christian influencer suggested that the coffee shop was trying to erase Christmas, Stetzer writes, when outraged Christians feed media outlets with stories that make Christians look foolish, that hurts the gospel. It adds to the perception that Christians are rage-addicted snowflakes and, more important, distracts Christians from their mission. That's what fake controversies and unwarranted anger do. Stetzer's words are strong, but do serve as a reminder for Christians to focus upon sharing our faith in love than becoming angry and offended by our culture. One thing that I found helpful is to remember the overall story of Christianity. Broadly speaking, we believe in a 5-part story. Number 1, God created the world and it was good. Number 2, we turned our backs upon God and the whole world has fallen into sin. 3, Jesus entered the story and brought redemption through his death upon the cross and resurrection. 4, there is a day of justice coming when God will put an end to all of the suffering and injustice in our world. And 5, God will usher in a new creation where those who are followers of Jesus live with him eternally. Now, we thank God that we are on our way to the new creation, but for now, we live in the tension between the fall and redemption, and that's the point. When we see political unrest, polarised culture, or many different types of harms and injustice in our world, the Christian worldview affirms this, that the world is not right, that it was never intended to be this way. Yes, Jesus has brought redemption, but we are waiting for a final day of justice and the new creation. Keeping this in mind enables me not to be drawn into the toxic polarisation of our culture because it offers unique explanatory power for much of the ills we see in our world. It is also good news for our polarised culture because it brings hope that things will not always be this way. Creation, fall, redemption, justice, and new creation or restoration. And with this trajectory in mind, and whilst we might work to bring about justice in our world, that is a good thing, our desire for ultimate justice and restoration cannot be realized through the political systems of this world. So, how can we address questions from our polarized culture? In a moment, I'm going to share a helpful structure when responding to questions from our culture. But first, I'd like to issue a word of caution. Now, wherever we may land in terms of our political views, it's important to honour questions of culture, even if they don't affect us personally. For example, if someone asks, shouldn't religious schools be banned? We should try to understand their concerns rather than dismiss this as an attack upon Christianity. The second caution is around language. It's important for Christians not to join in with the toxicity or name-calling in our polarised culture, but meet people where they are. An example of this is with the Apostle Paul in Acts 17, where he quotes poets that his audience would know and understand in order to point people to Jesus. In verse 28 of Acts 17, Paul says, "For in him we live and move and have our being." As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Here he is quoting the philosophers Epimenides and Aratus, which would have been known to his audience. The example of Paul might seem a little bit far away from us, but much closer to home might be words like woke. This is now used as a pejorative to label people with left-leaning views. However, calling someone woke in an evangelistic conversation is likely to offend rather than present a case for the gospel winsomely. The same goes for bigot and other pejorative words for those who have right-leaning political views. A helpful resource for understanding some of the context behind the word woke is a BBC Sounds documentary entitled Woke, The Journey of a Word. In it, Matthew Syed traces the first ever use of woke appearing on a 1938 recording by the musician Leadbelly. The track, entitled Scottsboro Boys, describes the plight of 9 young black men wrongly accused of rape in Alabama in 1931. Matthew hears the story of the Scottsboro Boys, discovering how their case became an international symbol of race-based injustice and a nucleus of the US civil rights movement. Precision around language is so important to our Christian witness. Neil Shenvi and Pat Sawyer also offer words of caution when they write, "Everyone, especially Christians, should speak with as much precision as possible. For example, we should not use terms like cultural Marxism, socialism, critical race theory, intersectionality, anti-racism, and critical theory interchangeably. If we do, it will open us up to easy accusations of carelessness, superficiality, and ignorance." Now, this is part of their book called Critical Dilemma, The Rise of Critical Theories and Social Justice Ideology, Implications for the Church and Society. So we've considered how the Christian worldview, the story of Christianity, gives us a framing for understanding why there is so much polarization in our culture. We're in between the time of the fall and redemption. We're waiting for ultimate justice and restoration. We've considered how we should honour the questions of culture, even if we don't like what people have to say. And we've also considered how we must use appropriate language when in discussion. So what about a structure? How might we respond to the questions of our culture in a respectful and honouring way? When I'm asked a question that maybe I find difficult or disconcerting, I try to use the acronym ASK, A-S-K. Now, A stands for 3 A's, AAA, and it is what can you affirm in or about the question? What is it that you might agree with? If someone's angry about something, maybe you understand their anger. Then what assumptions are there within the question? Is the person assuming certain things about Christianity, about life, that aren't actually warranted? And number 3, what are the aches or the longings for the gospel within the question? Is there something about what they're asking that actually ultimately points them to God, points them to justice, points them to something about the person of Jesus? S from our acronym ASK stands for state. What 2 or 3 things can you state to challenge the assumptions behind the question? And finally, K, and this is a little bit cheesy, but we're going to use it anyway. What can you say to keep your response focused upon Jesus? Now, as cheesy as that might sound, it's really important because sometimes we can use information, we can use data, we can use our research to respond to someone's question really well. But then do we stop there? No, we want to point people to Jesus. We're not about making ourselves look good, making someone else feel stupid, but actually pointing people to Jesus. Now, the K part of ask is so important because it reminds us we're not about winning arguments, we're about winning people. ASK. So let me give you an example of that. What if someone says, isn't the Bible a tool of oppression? Isn't the Bible a tool of oppression? Now, we can affirm possibly the anger in that question because there are examples from history where the Bible has been used as a tool of oppression. One such example is the 1807 Slave Bible, where passages of the Bible were removed and some passages were kept there and given to those who were enslaved on plantations. So the Bible in this instance was weaponized to oppress. We've got the receipts from history. But then what assumptions are they making? Well, the assumptions are that behind the Bible is this agenda to oppress and suppress people. But the reason that can be undone and challenged is because when you take the whole body of scripture, we actually see that there is a God who sets people free. The enslavers needed to chop up the Bible and butcher the Bible in order for it to be made into this oppressive text. But if you read the Bible in its entirety, you see a God who wants people to be liberated and set free. And finally, how do we keep this on Jesus? Well, we might share how in his life and ministry, Jesus faced oppression from the Roman Empire, from the religious elite, but yet he overcame that oppression through his death and resurrection. I would encourage you to utilize this structure, ASK, to think through some maybe polarizing questions of culture. For instance, what about assisted dying? So finally, in what practical ways can we stay focused upon the gospel? Now, I would encourage you, regardless of where you land politically, to follow and listen and read people with whom you disagree. Sometimes we can create echo chambers where we only listen to people whom we agree with, and then we lose sight of the very humanity of people that share different views to us. The second thing is to verify and fact check information before sharing it. We live in a culture where people share information in WhatsApp groups, in Facebook, in TikTok, wherever we might share something, and we take it as fact and truth before actually checking, is this story real? And this is really important for Christians because we're told in the 10 Commandments not to bear false witness against our neighbours. We should also consider the pain behind our polarised culture. If someone asks the question around assisted dying, for instance, we should consider the pain behind that question. For instance, the idea that death is a thief, the idea that death and suffering was never meant to be part of our story, before we just dismiss questions. Next, we should also consider how our polarised culture reveals gospel aches and longings. Whether you're on the left or right of politics, people want justice. Justice points us to God. That is a gospel longing. We want the world to be right. We want the world to be better. That points us to the God of justice himself. And finally, as I've said before, use appropriate language in public discourse. Let's not get too inflammatory with our language and insist upon saying things in our Christianese bubble when actually being able to have a credible witness in public discourse means kind of learning the language of our peers to be able to have a seat at the table. So a lot to take on board here, but I really hope this summary of our session at Keswick Convention, how do we transform our polarised culture, how do we make sense of it, has been really helpful to you.